So let's talk about the scientific method. Basically, the scientific method is just a process that scientists follow when they're trying to answer questions. So here are the steps. We're not going to actually put them in order. They're already in order. First, you come up with a question. So you're doing something and something happens, or you observe something and you kind of think, well, why did that happen? So you form a question. When you do that, you do kind of some background research and see what's already known about your question. Then you can form a hypothesis, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that's basically just a prediction or a guess to the answer of your question. Then, based on your hypothesis, you can set up an experiment. When you do the experiment, it will give you some kind of data. It could be numbers, it could be observations, but you collect that data and then you analyze it. You kind of determine what it means. And when you determine what it means, you can then form a conclusion. So that's going to be your answer to your original question. What's also important is this last one that a lot of people seem to forget is this retesting of your experiment. So when you do one experiment, you get a conclusion. That's great, but how do you know that it's real? How do you know that your experiment was accurate? Well, you should retest multiple times to make sure that you get the same result over and over. Then you can start to believe it more. So just be familiar with that. That's a great EOC question. You got to make sure that you retest. Okay, so questions. When we're talking about science, you have to have testable questions. You can come up with all kinds of different questions, but in order to be able to make up an experiment, it has to be testable. So this bullet point right here is pretty much saying that it needs to be specific. It needs to be specific and it needs to be something that can actually be answered through an investigation or experiment. You have to be able to collect evidence to answer your question. Also down here, when we're talking about science in this class, we're not going to be talking about supernatural things. So when we're talking about testable questions, it can't be related to supernatural things that can't really be measured. So you can't say a ghost did it. Yes, I know there's some ghost hunters out there and they have all kinds of fancy equipment, but for this class, we're going to focus just on the natural world. So things need to be specific, they need to be able to be answered by experiment, and they cannot be based off supernatural phenomenon. So here's an example. Here's two questions here. Just think about it for a second if you want to pause and try to determine, because I'm going to give you the answer in a minute. Determine which one of these is a testable question. How do rockets work versus how does changing the shape of a rocket's fins affect its ability to fly? If you haven't paused it yet, I would do that now. The answer here is this one. This one sounds like an experiment. You could actually set this up. You could build different rockets, and of course we're talking about rockets that you can shoot off in your yard, but you can put different shaped fins on it to actually do an experiment with this. If you're trying to answer how do rockets work, well, that could be 100 different experiments. It's not specific enough. It's too broad. It's too vague. So that's just an example of a testable question. So let's talk about a hypothesis. As I said before, you come up with a question, you do kind of some background research, and then you just make an educated guess or a prediction of what you think the answer is going to be to your question. A hypothesis is just a fancy name for that. So it's a statement that predicts something. It is also testable, which goes along with the testable question. And the best way to write that is in an if-then statement. So what does that mean? If you write a hypothesis, you can write, if I do this, then this will happen. So the key words here are if and then. And when we write hypotheses in this classroom, we will write them as if then. So make sure you remember that. If, there we go, if, then, very important. If this happens or if I do this, then this will happen. So if then hypotheses. So let's do a practice. Here's your question. You're boiling water on the stove and you want to throw some salt in there for flavor for when you put the food in. And then you're wondering to yourself, is salt going to speed this up or is this going to slow this down? So what could a hypothesis be here? A good hypothesis, again, is going to be if then. So let's go ahead and write that out. So if, so what are we changing here? Well, we're going to put salt or not put salt. So if I, and I apologize for the handwriting, put salt in water, well, I'm going to make a prediction that it's going to speed up the boiling. So here's my if. Sorry. If I put salt in water, then the water will boil faster. Maybe you think it's slower. That's fine. That could be your hypothesis. The good thing about a hypothesis is it doesn't always have to be right. It's just a guess. Your experiment will tell you if you're right or not. Your data will tell you if you're right or not. And it's not really about being right. You're making a guess. You get an answer regardless if it goes against or it supports your hypothesis. The point here, make sure you write things as if then. It's the easiest way to write a hypothesis. And you don't need to put an explanation here. Just if I put salt in water, then the water will boil faster. You don't need to say because blah, blah, blah. So just stick with simple if then. Okay, so that's an example of a hypothesis. Experimental design. So we talked about a question and a hypothesis. Now we need to talk about when you design an experiment, you kind of have to have certain factors involved with your design. So there's something called variables, which we're going to talk about the independent and dependent. There's something called a control, and there's something called a constant. And we're going to talk about each of those briefly. So let's start with the variables. And I'm sure you've heard these before, and a lot of students get these mixed up. So really try to find tricks to remember these. The independent variable is the variable in the experiment that you can change. With the if-then hypothesis, this is usually the if. If I do this, that's usually your independent variable. It's the thing that you change. If you remember this I in independent, you can remember this is the variable that I can change in the experiment as the scientist or as the researcher. It's what you change on purpose. Okay, so just remember that I and I change it. The dependent variable is always going to be what you measure in the experiment. So if you're doing an experiment with plants and you want to change temperature and see how it affects plant growth, well, you can measure plant growth by measuring the height that the plant grows. So you can put a group of plants in one temperature, you can put another group in another temperature, another group in another temperature, and then measure the plant growth. Well, what's going to be the dependent variable? Well, what are we measuring? We're measuring plant growth. So that's going to be the dependent variable. That's what you measure. So if you can remember the difference between these two based off that, you'll be good to go. If one is easier for you to identify first, start with that one. If it's easier for you to find out which one you can change, then start with independent. If it's easier for you to identify what you're going to measure, then start with that one. Because if you know one, you can figure out the other one. Okay? So let's do an example. What is the effect of lack of sleep on weight gain of an individual? First thing you should do, and I'm not sure if I wrote this down, okay, to determine the independent and dependent variable, the first thing you want to do is identify the two things in your question that might change. So if we read through our question, there's going to be two factors here that can change. What is the effect of lack of sleep? Well, that could change because depending on how much sleep you get or how much sleep you don't get. On weight gain, well, here's another factor. So there's two factors here that might change. Lack of sleep and weight gain. Now, once we have those, let me see what I have on the next slide. Okay, good. Here's your two factors that we just circled. Lack of sleep and weight, or weight gain, however you want to write that. These are our two factors in our question. These are the things that we can change and measure. So which one are you going to change and measure? That's what you're going to do here. Here's the tricks again. The independent variable is what I have control over. It's what I'm going to change. The dependent variable is what is being measured. So again, start with the one that makes sense. To me, the independent variable makes sense the best, so I always start there. So I'll run through an example like that, and then I'll show you the other way to do it. So if I was going to determine which one I can have control over, well, if I look up here, lack of sleep, I have control over that, right? I can determine if I sleep 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours or not at all. I can control that. So I'm going to mark that because I can control that. Weight gain. Indirectly, yes, I can affect that. I can eat a bunch of food and try to gain weight, or I can not eat a lot and try to lose weight, but that's going to take time. An independent variable is something you can change right then. You can make a decision to do it right then. So I can't just look at my body and say gain weight. I can't do that. I can't control this. Okay? So this is a better independent variable, the lack of sleep here. So that's going to be your independent. Well, now that I know that, I know this has to be dependent. Okay? You can also do this the other way around. So let me erase this just so I can explain it doing the other way. So let's say you're better at identifying the dependent variable. You can determine better what you're going to measure. Okay, well, you can do it that way too. So if you're doing an experiment and you want to see how the amount of sleep you get affects weight gain, well, what you're going to measure each day is the weight gain, right? You can weigh yourself each day and see how sleep has an effect on that. So what you're going to measure is the weight. So that's the dependent variable. That leaves the lack of sleep as the independent. So what you need to do is figure out which one you can do best and start with that one always. Okay? So there's an example for that. Let's do one more example. Do tomato plants raised with music grow more tomatoes? Pause this and see if you can figure it out on your own, and I'll give you the answer. So if you haven't paused it, do that now. Okay. What I would do first is, again, identify the two factors that are being studied. What can change? Well, music can change. I can do different types of music. I can do with and without music. That's something that can change. Grow more tomatoes. Well, this is a factor. How many tomatoes are growing? So there's two factors I got there. Now I just got to identify which one's which. Okay? Again, if you want to go back to the rewind this and go back to how to do this, starting with either the independent or dependent, do that. I'm just going to tell you what's what here. The music is what you can change, so that's going to be your independent variable. I can change what type of music or how much music or if they get music or not music. I can control this in the experiment. What I'm going to measure is the growth. I'm going to count how many tomatoes are growing. Okay, so that's the dependent variable. So again, dependent's what you measure, independent is what you change in the experiment. And if you look at an if-then statement for hypothesis, the if part is usually the independent and the then part is usually the dependent. So if I play music, then more tomatoes will grow. You can see how that kind of fits. It's usually if independent, then dependent. Okay, so far we talked about independent, dependent. Now we need to talk about controls. Controls in an experiment is the normal or the untreated. Because when you're doing an experiment and you're measuring things, you need something to compare it to. You need a normal to compare it to. Because how do you know if whatever you changed actually made a difference in what you're measuring? You need something to compare it to. That's what the control is. So it serves as a baseline or a normal where you're not changing the independent variable. Okay? So here's an example. Carly's setting up an experiment to see how increased amounts of fertilizer can affect plant growth. What would be the best control group? Well, you want what's normal. So she's going to put different groups of plants with different amounts of fertilizer. So let's say group 1 has a little bit of fertilizer. Group 2 has a medium amount of fertilizer. And group 3 has a lot of fertilizer. Well, if you measure that, yes, you can kind of see a difference between group, but what's the normal? Well, the normal would be plants with no fertilizer. That's a great control because you're seeing how the plants are growing without your independent variable. Because your independent variable is changing the amount of fertilizer. Okay, so plants growing with no fertilizer would be a great control for this because it's a normal. It's an untreated. We're going to skip constants for now and just do a couple practices with independent and dependent. So Mr. McNeese wanted to see how different types of music affected students' pulse rates. He played different types of music. So identify the independent variable. Well, what can I change in the experiment? I can change types of music. So that's my independent. Okay? Let's do dependent. What's going to be the dependent variable in this? Well, it's going to be what we're going to measure. And what are we going to measure? Well, we're going to measure the pulse rates when we're doing our experiments. So that's going to be our dependent variable. Okay? Independent's what I can change. Dependent is what you measure. Okay? Let's just one more reminder of what everything is. Independent is what I change. Dependent is what I measure or what I observe. And then the control is what's normal or untreated. Okay, so you always need something that's untreated or normal to compare your experiment to. For instance, I'll go back to our example here. Having a group where no fertilizer is added to the plants will serve as a great control for your experiment that you can compare all your results to. Okay, I hope you understand this stuff. Feel free to rewind and watch this as many times as you need. And if you need more help, just come talk to me and we can go over it some more.